Betrayal rarely happens suddenly. It starts with small things, hidden messages, unexpected excuses, brief meetings that go unmentioned. One person is lying, keeping secrets, enjoying the illusion of freedom. The other begins to suspect, searching for proof, and with each passing day, the need for control turns into obsession. This story is about how infidelity led to the most devastating consequences. When jealousy transforms into a desire for destruction and love turns into manipulation, predicting the outcome becomes impossible. What started as an ordinary affair ended in a way no one could have foreseen. In September 2023, a small suburban home became the scene of one of the most shocking and unpredictable events in recent history. Officers responding to the call had no idea that this case would turn out to be more than just a violent crime. It was a carefully orchestrated game where every participant was nothing more than a pawn. Nathaniel Ruiz Jr. was born around 1993 in one of Chicago's most troubled neighborhoods. His exact birth date remains unknown, emphasizing the chaos that surrounded his early life. He grew up in an environment where aggression and criminal activity were part of everyday existence. From a young age, Nathaniel displayed signs of an impulsive and uncontrollable nature. In school, he frequently got into fights, clashed with teachers, and showed little interest in academics. His first run-in with the law happened during his teenage years when he was caught participating in a robbery. However, since he was underage, he avoided any serious punishment. It didn't take long for him to realize that the criminal world offered more than just an adrenaline rush. It also brought financial rewards. As time went on, his offenses became more severe. In 2016, he was arrested for assault, and a year later, he was taken into custody again for driving under the influence. But Nathaniel's real fascination was with firearms. He collected weapons and took pride in his growing arsenal. His social media accounts were filled with photos of handguns, rifles, and ammunition. Eventually, this activity caught the attention of law enforcement, and a court ruling prohibited him from owning any firearms. However, Nathaniel had no intention of complying. Ignoring the restriction, he continued to acquire weapons through illegal means. Despite his legal troubles, he decided to start a business and launched a private security company. However, the operation was entirely illegitimate. He lacked the necessary license, and legally, he wasn't even allowed to carry a firearm. Nevertheless, he aggressively promoted his services on social media, posting photos of himself wearing body armor and carrying weapons. Linda Palomo was born on February 3, 1973. By the time she met Nathaniel, she was an independent woman, a mother of 5 and already a grandmother. Unlike Nathaniel, she grew up in a relatively stable family, but her personal life had been complicated. She married young, but the marriage didn't last. Left to raise her sons and daughters on her own, she learned to handle life's struggles without relying on anyone. She worked multiple jobs to support her family and helped care for her grandchildren. Despite everything, she still longed for personal happiness. Linda was known for her strong personality. Her family respected her, though some found her overly strict. She liked to be in control, ensuring that everything happened on her terms. Betrayal was something she couldn't tolerate, and she expected unwavering loyalty from those closest to her. When Nathaniel entered her life, no one could quite understand what connected them. He was 20 years younger, had a troubled past, and a volatile temperament. Yet their relationship developed quickly. Their meeting was purely coincidental. Some say they met through mutual acquaintances. At first, Linda didn't take Nathaniel seriously, but his confidence, persistence, and dangerous charisma drew her in. For Nathaniel, Linda was someone who made him feel secure. She provided him with shelter and emotional support. For Linda, it was something new, an experience she hadn't had before. She felt in control, as if she was the one shaping this younger man's path. Their connection was unusual. Two people so different, yet somehow held together by that very contrast. They moved in together, and before long, Linda's sons, daughters, and grandchildren were living under the same roof. The house became crowded, but it wasn't a home filled with warmth. The tension was growing. Neighbors and acquaintances noticed that their relationship was anything but harmonious. Nathaniel had a short fuse, while Linda insisted on keeping everything under control. Their romance resembled a ticking time bomb, but no one could have predicted how far things would go. Nathaniel had no intention of giving up his collection, even with legal restrictions in place. He continued acquiring handguns and rifles through illegal sources, making shady deals and exploiting legal loopholes. He enjoyed displaying his strength and took pride in his growing arsenal. He could spend hours discussing calibers, mechanisms, and modifications, or simply admiring his collection. At first, it was just a fascination. But over time, firearms became an inseparable part of his daily life. He carried a handgun even inside the house, often disassembling and reassembling it right at the kitchen table. He left his weapons out in the open, and it didn't take long for those around him to start feeling uneasy. At first, Linda didn't interfere. She didn't care much about what Nathaniel was up to as long as he was bringing money into the house. She turned a blind eye to the fact that his business was illegal and never asked questions. But over time, she began to realize it wasn't just about the money. Nathaniel's behavior was becoming more unpredictable. He would lash out if something didn't go his way. Sometimes he'd lose his temper over the smallest things, someone looking at him the wrong way or speaking at the wrong time. His outbursts came suddenly, but just as quickly, he'd calm down, acting as if nothing had happened. The first to openly express concern was Christina, one of Linda's daughters. She saw what others either missed or ignored. Nathaniel wasn't just an unpleasant person. He was someone capable of anything. Christina never trusted him. She noticed how he talked about aggression, how he carried himself as if he were superior to everyone else. He couldn't stand being contradicted and always made sure he had the final say. But what scared her the most was how easily he could snap. During one argument, he clenched his fist so tightly that his knuckles turned white. At that moment, Christina knew, if he wasn't stopped, one day he would cross the line. The atmosphere in the house grew more and more tense. No one spoke about it openly, but the fear of Nathaniel was becoming impossible to ignore. And this was only the beginning. By 2021, Nathaniel and Linda had been living together for 6 years. On the surface, everything seemed stable, but their relationship had long since lost its foundation. Nathaniel had never been the type to stay loyal to one woman, but now his affairs had become routine. He met people through social media, started new relationships, then quickly moved on to the next. Secret conversations became a daily habit. He used messaging apps, hid his contacts, and meticulously deleted his conversations. He often left the house late at night, claiming it was for work, meetings with clients, or personal matters. Sometimes, Linda would wake up in the middle of the night and find that he wasn't home. He would return in the early hours, never offering an explanation. Nathaniel wasn't afraid of getting caught. He believed Linda either wouldn't find out or wouldn't dare to do anything about it. He was convinced he was in control, but he underestimated her. At first, Linda ignored the changes in his behavior, but over time, she began noticing how often he was gone, how frequently he was texting someone, how suddenly he started paying more attention to his appearance. She didn't immediately put the pieces together, but the suspicion was growing. Her patience finally ran out when she happened to see a message pop up on his phone, one that left no room for doubt. The text hinted at a recent meeting, confirming what she had long suspected. But Linda didn't explode right away. She understood that if Nathaniel was being unfaithful, it meant he felt untouchable. Instead of confronting him, she decided to gather more evidence. She started watching him closely, checking his messages, analyzing his habits. Now she could tell when he was lying, when he was trying to cover his tracks, when he was sneaking off to another meeting. Linda wasn't the kind of woman who forgave betrayal. Her personality wouldn't allow her to simply accept the situation or walk away without consequences. She had no intention of causing a dramatic scene, but she also wasn't going to let Nathaniel get away with it. With each new piece of proof, her anger grew. She saw two options: leave and cut him out of her life, or make him regret every decision he had made. And the longer she thought about it, the clearer it became. She wasn't going to be just another woman he left behind. Linda wasn't about to act on impulse. She knew that a direct confrontation with Nathaniel could escalate into something uncontrollable. So, she chose a different approach. Instead of a heated argument, she started planning a more subtle form of revenge. She needed something that would make his life unbearable, something that would turn the tables and put him in a vulnerable position. She didn't yet know what her next move would be, but she was certain of one thing: Her silence was just the calm before the storm. After months of careful observation, Linda began putting her plan into action. The first step, creating fake accounts. She registered multiple profiles on different platforms, using photos of random people and selecting believable names. Some of these accounts belonged to mysterious women, others to dangerous individuals with questionable backgrounds. Linda studied how online scams worked, learning the techniques used to deceive people and manipulate them into believing something, even if it wasn't true. She built an intricate system where each of her fake personas had a role to play. One could be a seductress, another someone who knew too much, and a third, an anonymous threat. Together, they would create an atmosphere of paranoia around Nathaniel, making him believe he was caught in a dangerous game. To make her scheme more convincing, Linda started researching criminal networks. She immersed herself in learning about underground organizations, studying their intimidation tactics, the language of threats, and the art of psychological manipulation. She read about the mafia, cartels, and underground networks that controlled the flow of illegal money. She studied their hierarchy, communication styles, and even tried to replicate their messaging patterns. But her most powerful tool was her ability to control information. Using specialized software and hidden features on social media, she learned how to track a person's location, access their contacts, and monitor conversations. Before long, she had acquired enough knowledge to make Nathaniel believe in the reality of her deception. Once everything was in place, Linda put her plan into motion. She was the first to reach out to Nathaniel using one of her fabricated accounts. The profile she created belonged to a mysterious woman who seemed genuinely interested in him. Nathaniel didn't suspect a thing. He was used to these kinds of connections and responded immediately. But unlike his usual online encounters, this one took an unexpected turn. After a few days of casual conversation, Linda, posing as her invented persona, began dropping hints that she knew about his past. Her messages contained just enough details to make him uneasy. Then she made the first move toward trapping him psychologically, sending him a message with his real-time location. This was just the beginning, but it was enough to put Nathaniel on edge. Linda had achieved her first victory. He was afraid. But she had no intention of stopping there. The initial scare worked. Nathaniel was getting nervous, but she needed more. She escalated the game by creating even more fake accounts. Now he wasn't just being contacted by strangers. He was surrounded by dangerous figures, Bulgarian mafia members, cartel enforcers, hitmen. Each had their own story, their own motives, their own demands. Messages came from different numbers and platforms. Some were threats, others offered protection, while a few presented him with bizarre ultimatums. One hinted that his survival depended on completing simple tasks. Another suggested that he was already caught in something much bigger and there was no way out. Nathaniel tried to make sense of it all, but there was no logic. Everything seemed terrifyingly real. His behavior started to change. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, avoiding calls from unknown numbers, checking to see if he was being followed. Sometimes, he even asked Linda to drive him to a different location, just to be sure he wasn't being tracked. He deleted messages, changed his passwords, and tried to throw off his pursuers, but all of it only deepened his paranoia. Linda knew exactly what she was doing. She could see how fear was eating away at his mind. Her plan was working. Nathaniel was no longer focused on his usual habits. His entire world revolved around fighting a threat that didn't even exist. What he failed to realize was that the real danger was much closer than he thought. In May 2023, a new woman entered Nathaniel's life, Zira. They met at his new job, where she was one of his colleagues. At first, their interactions were nothing out of the ordinary, but before long, they began taking an interest in each other. Zira was married and raising 2 children, but her family life didn't bring her happiness. She had a history of infidelity, and meeting Nathaniel was just another chapter in that pattern. She didn't see it as a problem. She believed her personal happiness mattered more than any social expectations. Nathaniel wasn't thinking about consequences either. His relationship with Linda had long since lost its meaning, and his affair with Zira gave him the excitement he'd been missing. It started with lingering glances and subtle hints, but soon they were talking constantly. Linda had been keeping tabs on Nathaniel for a long time. The moment he started interacting with Zira, she noticed. At first, she didn't think much of it. His brief affairs weren't news to her, but soon she realized this time was different. Their messages quickly escalated beyond casual flirtation. Nathaniel told Zira he loved her, that he dreamed of a future with her. She said the same. They made plans, imagined a new life together, and spoke as if everything would change one day. Linda read each message, one after another, unable to believe her eyes. She was consumed by humiliation. She had spent months weaving an elaborate scheme to keep Nathaniel under her control, forcing him to live in constant fear. And yet, despite everything, he was still living his life, completely oblivious to her efforts. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a mockery of her power. Linda could no longer stand by and watch. It was no longer about controlling him, it was about making him pay. She escalated her psychological game, introducing a new wave of threats. This time, the characters were even more menacing, even more persistent. The supposed mafia figures warned Nathaniel that he was in grave danger, that he was playing with fire. The message was clear. His involvement with Zira had to end immediately. But this time, he wasn't afraid. Everything he had endured over the past months had numbed him to fear. He believed he had already survived the worst. And besides, he was too consumed by his feelings for Zira to walk away now. For the first time, Nathaniel wasn't just hiding his affair, he was fighting for it. Linda changed her approach. She realized that if she wanted to break Nathaniel completely, she couldn't just target him. She had to go after Zira as well. The first step was planting fear in Alberto, Zira's husband. Using fake accounts, she sent him cryptic messages hinting at his wife's infidelity, attaching photos, and fueling his suspicions. When that didn't have the desired effect, she escalated her tactics, this time with direct threats. Alberto began receiving anonymous letters warning him that his family was in danger, that his loved ones could get hurt. Linda knew that fear for his family would force him to take action. The pressure worked. At first, Alberto tried to ignore the threats, but soon, the unease took hold. He had no idea who was behind it, but he could feel that this was more than just an issue between husband and wife. Linda had achieved exactly what she wanted. Tension was growing in Zira's home, and fear was beginning to dictate their decisions. Still, Nathaniel wasn't completely broken. Despite the paranoia Linda had planted, despite the relentless pressure from the fabricated criminal organizations, he still clung to Zira. Now, Linda decided to strike at his weakest point, his trust. She let him know that she was aware of Zira, and then began feeding him a new narrative, that Zira wasn't who she claimed to be. She convinced him that Zira was actually working for the mafia. Linda had gathered enough information to make this lie believable. She sent him messages from different informants, suggesting that Zira always knew more than she let on, and that her presence in his life wasn't a coincidence. She carefully crafted the illusion so that Nathaniel had no choice but to believe it. The messages hinted that his phone was being monitored, that his movements were being tracked, and that Zira was merely using him to gather information. Before long, Nathaniel started seeing the pieces fall into place. In his mind, everything finally made sense. This explained why the so-called mafia knew so much about him, why he was being followed, why Zira never seemed intimidated by the threats. But Linda didn't stop there. Now she demanded proof of his loyalty. Nathaniel had to prove that he wouldn't betray those who had supposedly saved him from a deadly fate. Slowly, the conversations about dealing with Zira and her family became more direct. The message was clear. There was no other way out. Exhausted, overwhelmed, and completely under Linda's control, Nathaniel finally gave in. He no longer questioned what was real. Linda had won. He was ready to do whatever it took. Nathaniel no longer questioned what had to be done. In his mind, there was no fear, no regret, only the firm belief that he was carrying out an unavoidable task. He began planning the crime with the same focus and precision he had once used to build his illicit business. The first step was surveillance. He studied Zira's schedule, noting when she was home and who was with her. He paid special attention to moments when her husband and family might be vulnerable. He examined the entrances to the house, mapped out possible escape routes, and spent several days tracking their movements, memorizing every detail. At the same time, he gathered supplies. He already had an arsenal, but he needed additional tools: new clothes, gloves, bags, tape, a flashlight. He and Linda went shopping together, careful not to draw attention. Linda remained in the background, making sure it never seemed like she was involved. They discussed every step as if preparing for a high-stakes operation. Linda played the role of an advisor, nudging Nathaniel in the right direction, reinforcing the idea that he had to do this correctly. She kept him convinced that this was the only way out. By the time everything was ready, Nathaniel had stopped thinking about consequences. He believed he was simply doing what needed to be done. The decision had been made. Now, all that was left was to act. The night arrived. The plan was about to become reality. Linda showed no sign of nerves, behaving as if she knew nothing. Late that night, they drove toward Zira's house. Linda was behind the wheel, driving calmly as if running an errand. She asked a few times why he needed to go there, but Nathaniel didn't answer. He didn't care what she thought. His focus was locked on his target. When they arrived, Linda stayed in the car while Nathaniel stepped out and walked toward the house. He already knew the front door would be locked, so he went around to the backyard, broke a window, and slipped inside. The sound of shattering glass woke Alberto. He got out of bed and went to check the noise. At that moment, Nathaniel fired, but missed. Alberto immediately realized this wasn't just a break-in. He spun around and ran toward the hallway, trying to reach his family's room, hoping to shield them from the intruder. But Nathaniel caught up with Alberto in the hallway. A few shots rang out, and Alberto collapsed to the floor before he could reach the door. The house fell silent, broken only by Nathaniel's heavy breathing. Hearing the gunfire, Zira barricaded herself in the bedroom with her family. She held them close, unsure who had come for them. Nathaniel tried to force the door open, but it held, so he aimed at the lock and fired. The bullet tore through the wood, striking Zira. She stopped moving. The door swung open. The room fell into a stunned silence. The last sounds the neighbors heard were short and muffled. It was over in minutes. Nathaniel surveyed the house. He overturned furniture to make it look like a robbery gone wrong, scattering items to stage a struggle. Then he walked back to the car, where Linda was waiting. She didn't even ask how it went. They simply drove away, leaving chaos behind. For a brief moment, silence filled Zira's home. But not for long. Neighbors, alarmed by the sound of gunfire and breaking glass, quickly called the authorities. The call came in around 4 a.m., and within minutes, officers arrived at the scene. They found signs of forced entry and moved inside. The scene before them left no doubt. This was no random act of aggression, but a meticulously planned crime. Nathaniel's first mistake was failing to cover all the details of the staged robbery. Nothing valuable was missing, and the evidence pointed to a deliberate attack rather than a break-in gone wrong. Even the scattered items did little to convince investigators that theft had been the motive. But the biggest mistake? It didn't take long for police to connect the crime to someone with a motive. By morning, detectives were already looking into Zira's personal connections. Everyone at work knew about her affair with Nathaniel. Colleagues described their relationship as more than just a casual fling. They had talked about a future together. Nathaniel's name quickly became the focus of the investigation. As detectives dug into his background, they uncovered a long list of prior offenses, illegal dealings, and a well-documented obsession with weapons. Everything pointed straight to him. While the police gathered evidence, Linda kept playing her game. She continued messaging Nathaniel under the guise of the mafia, reassuring him that everything was going according to plan. She fed him the illusion that he was being protected, that as long as he followed instructions, he would be safe. She made sure he believed one thing above all, that the authorities would never be able to prove his guilt. But the investigation was moving too fast. Detectives started digging into Nathaniel's recent activity and uncovered several inconsistencies. When they examined his calls and messages, they found that in the past few months, he had received an overwhelming number of threats, not from real criminal organizations, but from newly created anonymous accounts. This raised new questions. If the mafia was truly behind this, why did all the evidence point only to Nathaniel? Why were there so many coincidences? What if the threat wasn't real but carefully staged? These doubts became a turning point in the case. For the first time, investigators began to suspect that there was more to this story than just a gang-related crime. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Nathaniel realized he was running out of time. He knew the police were closing in, and his arrest was inevitable. Panic set in when he noticed that he was being followed. He tried convincing himself that the mafia would step in and protect him, but deep down, he knew the truth. Desperate for help, he turned to his mother. They met in a secluded spot, away from prying eyes. He told her he was in danger, that he was being accused of a serious crime, that he needed to disappear. But instead of support, he saw fear and hesitation. She didn't want to be involved. She understood that helping him meant becoming part of the crime. For a few days, Nathaniel attempted to stay hidden, but surveillance cameras caught him at a grocery store. He wasn't alone. Linda was with him. As soon as the police confirmed their location, a pursuit began. Patrol cars surrounded the area, but Linda and Nathaniel managed to get onto the highway. He was behind the wheel, and she sat beside him, watching the chaos unfold. The real question now was, who was truly in control? Nathaniel believed he was the one steering the situation, but in reality, everything was unfolding exactly as Linda had planned. The police had been chasing them for miles, but Nathaniel had no intention of stopping. He gripped the steering wheel, pushing the car faster, weaving through traffic, determined to escape. Adrenaline overpowered his fear. Linda sat beside him, eerily calm. She didn't tell him to stop. She didn't scream or beg him to surrender. She just watched, as if she already knew how this would end. They sped onto a congested stretch of highway. Nathaniel tried to swerve around a truck, but lost control at the last moment. The car skidded, slammed into the guardrail, and flipped multiple times before coming to a violent stop. When officers approached the wreckage, the inside of the vehicle was eerily silent. Nathaniel was still in the driver's seat, a gun in his hand. Linda was beside him, lifeless. In the final moments before the crash, he had fired at her, then turned the weapon on himself. Investigators later examined the scene, trying to understand why he had done it. Was it an act of revenge? A final outburst of rage? Or had he realized, in those last few seconds, who had truly been behind everything? Had Linda confessed to him during that final ride, revealing that it had all been her doing? There were no answers. The only two people who knew the truth were gone. But the investigation didn't stop with their deaths. Detectives combed through their recent movements, phone records, and messages. At first, police